Lots of things are getting better.
The notes are coming in a few minutes. Don't worry, I'll speak before you won't need them this second. I'm jumping straight in. Sefer, welcome everyone. I'm invited because I don't think it's not time. And I am super excited to come back to the Shulchan here. It's my home and it's lots of us. And it's really great to start taking another year. And this year we are 4 years of Sefer Bereshit. Is that okay? Yeah, except that it kind of after 4 years of Sefer Bereshit, we are moving books. And we are moving to Sefer Bamidbar. And I wanted to probably about 11 years ago now. And the reason why I chose Sefer Bamidbar is
Something's the matter. I don't hear. Nobody hears.
I can't hear her either.
I can't either. It's okay. It's something.
I can't either.
All right, I can't.
How do we tell?
They have to pick the microphone up from the floor.
Even when the microphone was on the table,
Ella,
you couldn't hear
can you
her.
hear me?
Nobody hears.
Yes, no?
Hardly.
Okay.
It's on mute.
Still can't hear anything. We can't hear anything.
No, we cannot hear.
Can't hear.
Faye, can you hear?
No, we can't hear.
We can hear the participants, but we can't.
Yeah, we hear each other.
Yeah.
Good morning, Rita.
But she's
Hi.
also, she doesn't look at the screen.
No, she said I'm working on it. Look at
Ah.
the chat.
I
She wrote,
didn't
"I'm
hear
working."
that. Thank you.
An hour. Because of scheduling at Matan, they've only given me an hour from 9:30 to 10:30. If there are enough people signed up, we may be able to move it to 9:20, which gives us an hour and 10 minutes, which is really probably better. So I urge everyone to sign up quickly so we can move it. However, at the moment, it starts at 9:30. The class, we are going to be starting exactly on time at 9:30. Okay, I'm jumping in. Sefer Bamidbar. Why did I choose it after Sefer Bereshit? Because it piques my curiosity every single time. Why? Sefer Bamidbar, can they hear? Sefer Bamidbar is a book that was never meant to be. And I think just that idea, right? The idea of something that wasn't meant to be piques our curiosity. Why is that important today? Because today we are living in a time where we have lost the ability to be curious. And if you want to, in my humble opinion, one of the ills of today's society, of today's culture, is the inability to be curious anymore. What do I mean? What is curiosity? Curiosity is when I ask myself, I'm interested. Something's mysterious, something I don't know, something I want to find out about, something about the other or about the world or about the unknown. And I'm curious to find it out. So what do I do when I'm curious? I go on a journey. I start listening. I hear. I'm all the time, my ears are open to hearing or finding out. Or that's a journey towards wisdom. To me, Sefer Bamidbar.
Everybody goes on Google, they have to do.
Exactly. So we've spoken a lot about it in the past, but today we live in a world of echo chamber. And echo chamber, especially on social media, is where I only hear my own opinion basically being vibrated back to me, echoed back to me all the time. That is why today we have extreme polarization in the world. That is why today we are finding, it's definitely in America, even now here in Israel even more, we are seeing that there is polarization to the left and the right, because we are only hearing our own opinion. We feel good, right? The algorithms in social media play to us what we want to hear. Why? Because we feel good when we hear someone telling us our own opinion. It makes us, it piques our ego, it makes us feel good about ourselves. But that is that suppresses or represses curiosity. And in my mind, curiosity is the key to growth. It's the key to wisdom. That's why for me, the Sefer Bamidbar is such an important book, because I'm curious. I'm curious about a lot of things. I'm curious about why it takes place, meaning it should never have been. We should have gone straight. Remember what's happened with Sefer Bereshit, the creation of the world on a macro level from chapters 1 to 11. Giving a very, very brief overview. Chapter 1 to 11, we have the universal story of mankind. Started reading it this week, last week in the Bet Knesset. 11 onwards, we have the story. 12 onwards, we have the story of Abraham. We move from the universal to the particular. It's a very strange movement. Usually, right, stories are told from the particular to the universal. Rabbi Sachs writes a lot about this. But in the Bible, we do the opposite. We do the opposite journey. We go from the universal to the particular. We are told about Abraham. The rest of Sefer Bereshit is about the choosing of the nation. Who is going to be the process of choosing? Abraham has 2 children, Ishmael and Yitzchak. Who is going to be chosen? Yitzchak. Yitzchak has 2 children. Who are they? Esau and Yaakov. Who is the chosen one of the nation? Yaakov. Again, all the way through what we see in Sefer Bereshit is there is no clarity. There are lots of moral dilemmas. There are lots of human moral dilemmas that each and every one of the avot are faced with, and sometimes they do not know what the right thing to do. An example is that Akedah. An example is Yaakov when he dupes his father and his brother. But we see that Yaakov is chosen. Yaakov has 12 sons. Who is chosen? Yafeh! Woo-hoo! All of them are chosen. Thank you for being in the Bereshit class, right? All of them are chosen, and they become Israel. Okay, that is where, and Israel then goes down. Thanks so much, Tanya. Goes down to Mitzrayim, and then we begin Sefer Shemot. If Sefer Bereshit is about the choosing of the nation, Sefer Shemot is about the building of the nation. It's about how we are turned from how we create. Just yesterday, I was teaching Rabbi Sachs, who speaks about the idea of a social contract and a social covenant. Sefer Shemot is about a social covenant. How do you build a nation? You begin not with a state and politics. That's not the immediate way to creating a stable society. You begin first and foremost by a nation, forming a nation. How do we do that? So God chose to do that through slavery. We were slaves, we became free people, and then we eventually, Sefer Shemot tells us about the journey from slavery to free people. There's more sheets coming. Slavery to free people. It's a very important book. Those of you that are interested, those of you who would learn with me the last few years will know that Leon Cass is one of my favorite authors. He's come out with a new book on Exodus, highly recommend it, on Sefer Shemot. Okay, there again, he talks a lot about this idea of how do you form a nation? Why was it important for the people to go through this journey of slavery to freedom? We're not going to get into it now. Maybe after we finish Sefer Bamidbar, we'll do Sefer Shemot. Okay, and then we have Sefer Vayikra. And again, nothing here is 100%. It's all chronological, but it's not a historical book. So Sefer Bereshit takes place over hundreds of thousands of years. Sefer Shemot is a few hundred years. Sefer Vayikra is a few days, okay? Just to have that in mind, Sefer Vayikra is almost the manifesto, right? So you've got the choosing of the nation, you've got the building of the nation, and Sefer Vayikra is almost the manifesto of the nation. How do you bind these people together? You speak about building a construct for God, building a world for God, the Mishkan, the way in which sacrifices, how do we turn our slave mentality into something constructive, into routine, into something permanent, something that will endure? And the answer is Sefer Vayikra. Again, we don't have time to go into why, but Sefer Vayikra introduces routine. It introduces a way in which we can connect to something transcendent, which is God. It introduces the idea of how we journey even as a nation, how we, in a sense, if Sefer Bereshit is the macro unfolding of chaos to order, Sefer Vayikra is the micro unfolding of chaos as a nation to order. Okay, they parallel each other. Sefer Bereshit, the beginning parallels Sefer Vayikra. And then at the end of Sefer Vayikra, we begin our journey to the land. And we are ready. And we have, at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, we're going to see, we are encamping around the Mishkan. We are told, there's a counting. That's why Sefer Bamidbar is called the book of numbers, right? Because it begins with the counting. We are counted as a nation. We are going to go into Eretz Yisrael, right? And then what happens? Anyone want to guess or tell me? Because I guess, oh, some coffee was taken away. Anyone want to counter a guess? Why don't we go into Eretz Yisrael? Shout it out. Shlach lecha the meraglim. That's the obvious one, but there's something that happens even before that. The egel is not a reason not to go into Eretz Yisrael. It's very, very important. But God still says these people can go into the land. He kind of says, okay, I'll change the way I relate to them, and I can't relate to them in a very direct kind of sin and punishment way anymore. I'm going to give them this idea of rachamim. I'm going to give this idea of chesed. So the egel not 100%, but there's another one, Parashat Ba'alotcha. What happens there? No, the Mapilim's after Shlach Lecha. Parashat Ba'alotcha is the He ben Saharon. Remember, it's in inverted commas. Okay, this good, excellent. That's why you're all here. We're going to learn all of this, right? And essentially, that is when the people start complaining. If you look, we're going to talk about it, okay? But if you look, this is before Shlach Lecha. Immediately, Moshe's counted the people. They're all ready to go into the land. And all of a sudden, the people start, commit onanim rabba onei beznei Hashem. They start complaining. The people start complaining. And what do they do? What do they say? We want to go back to Mitzrayim. And then we have this very strange pasuk, the Vihi ben Saharon, which is in kind of brackets, right? And then immediately after that, we have Moshe absolutely losing it. There's no other way of putting it. We've never seen him like that before. And we're going to unpack this whole narrative because in my mind, this is the beginning of the downfall. It's true that in Shlach Lecha, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But before that, it's already spiraled out of control. Before that, or before Shlach Lecha, the people already have shown us that they are not ready to be a free people in their land. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, we're meant to be going into Eretz Yisrael. And about a quarter of the way through, the Gzeirah is given, right? The decree is given. We're not going into Eretz Yisrael. And the rest of Sefer Bamidbar is about what? Anyone? It's about our journeys in the Midbar, moving around, narratives that happen.
About the process of getting
Generations
ready.
are out, new generation being born.
Constant unhappiness that just keeps surging forward. And it's like you're stuck in place and it just keeps sort of exploding. You're Torah, but like it just.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It almost feels like they're stuck, right? It is what I like to call the in-between space. Hey, Bamidbar, and a midbar is literally that. It is a space in between. And that, to me, piques my curiosity. What does it mean, a book that was never meant to be? What does it mean that they had to go through this interim period of dying out and being born in order to go into Eretz Yisrael? What do all of these things mean to us? And what I want to do by way of introduction is to introduce the book. We're going to have 2 or 3 lessons of introduction. I'm just warning everyone. So those coming to get a taste, you'll get a taste of kind of the way I teach, but you won't necessarily get a taste yet of Sefer Bamidbar. To do that, you have to sign up. What I want to do is to look at the idea of how we analyze text, what text analysis is, what learning Torah is, right? What it means to open up the book of Torah and learn Torah. And I want to do it through the prism of this idea of the Midbar, this idea of what Sefer Bamidbar is. So the idea of curiosity, the idea of an interim space, how the text itself is an interim space. And that's what we're going to unpack. I brought you to begin. I hope most people have got sheets. Have you? Still haven't got sheets. Oh, they're on their way.
Just a comment. When somebody asks a question or makes a comment, to repeat it because the people don't hear it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I want to read you a very unusual source. In the summer, I allow myself to read fictional books. I have to be honest, I don't know what, it's actually a bit depressing. I kind of find it very difficult to read fictional books anymore, unless they are amazing, amazing, amazing books. I can't, it just doesn't hold my attention. But this one book held my attention. Matt Haig is a very well-known, he's actually, the way I got him originally is he wrote a book called 10 Reasons to Stay Alive. It's a book about his journey, his depression, anxiety, and his journey through it. He then more recently wrote a brilliant book, which, by the way, those of you that have got teenage kids, especially teenage daughters like I've got, I gave my daughter both his books to read. But the book in particular that I would read is Notes from a Nervous Planet. Amazing book, amazing, and so worth reading yourselves for sure, and then giving your kids to read. Okay, Notes from a Nervous Planet. But those are not fictional. But this book, The Midnight Library, is a fictional book, and it's very sweet and very easy reading. But it's actually a lot of food for thought, because he's a thinker, so you can see it in his writing. And the story is essentially that this girl basically has given up on life and decides she's going to commit suicide. And she goes to take her life, and as she does so, or talk a day, she gets thrown into this what's called the Midnight Library. And the Midnight Library is an endless corridor of books. Endless corridor of books. That's why I love it, right? The imagery just got me for as soon as I read it.
That's what it's called,
the Midnight Library. And in the Midnight Library, what she can do, right? Before she moves on to her next life, she can choose any book, and that will give her a life. It will take her to a life that she didn't have, a different life. Okay, so the book is all about her going through the different manifestations of how her life would have played out. Why? As I was prepared, I read this book, it was quite a while ago, but as I was praying Sefer Bamidbar, this is how my mind works, I was thinking about the Midnight Library, because I kept thinking about the fact that the Torah is doing something amazing here, especially when we get to Vihi ben Saharon, Parshat Ba'alotcha, you're going to see it because it is so clear there. So much so that Chazal, in Parshat Ba'alotcha, Chazal say that in the Torah, there are not 5 books of the Torah, there are 7 books of the Torah. What do they include? They include the Vihi ben Saharon. There's more coming. They include the Vihi ben Saharon in it, what came before and what came after, meaning they see Sefer Bamidbar as 3 books, right? And that, I kept thinking when I read that midrash about what he writes in the Midnight Library, how we all have choices. And I just brought for you something he wrote, because I think it's so poignant and so applicable to what we're going to be doing this year. He says like this: between life and death, those of you that don't have the sheets, I will read slowly. Between life and death, there is a library. And within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see things, how things would be if you had made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets. And even if you were a pawn, maybe we all are, then you should remember that a pawn is the most magical piece of all. It might look small and ordinary, but it isn't, because a pawn is never just a pawn. A pawn is a queen in waiting. All you need to do is find a way to keep moving forward, one square after another, and you can get to the other side and unlock all kinds of power. When you stay too long in a place, you forget just how big an expanse the world is. You get no sense of the length of those longitudes and latitudes. Just as she supposed, it is hard to have a sense of the vastness inside any one person. But once you sense that vastness, once something reveals itself, hope emerges, whether you want it to or not. And it clings to you as stubbornly as a lichen clings to rock. Lichen clings to rock. That the prison wasn't the place. And she realizes, okay, eventually, that the prison wasn't the place, but the perspective. Okay, really recommend reading the book. What do I want to say here? Sefer Bamidbar, if you look throughout, it's all about perspective. We're going to be seeing it. There's a few themes and motifs that run through Sefer Bamidbar. One of the biggest themes is eyes. Many, many times. Firstly, I just straight after Meraglim, which mitzvah do we have? Tzitzit, right? And what does it say about mitzvah? Uotam, okay, or zachatam, right? The idea of the Meraglim is all about what they see, okay? The idea all the time with Yitro says to Moshe, says to Yitro, come with us because we need you to be our eyes. Okay, all the time, the whole way through Sefer Bamidbar, what we're going to be seeing repeat itself again and again is the idea of perspective. Our perspective matters. The way we look at reality matters, and it matters even more so when we are about to enter our land. If we do not enter our land with the correct perspective, we will not survive. And that is a message today, more than ever, as we enter into our fourth elections in 3 years, fifth elections in 4 years, whatever it happens to be, okay? It matters how we look at things. Okay, and I say this because it's going to be such an important imagery that keeps repeating itself. Why not stun? Because it's the message that the people have to adopt before they come into the land. Over Simchat Torah, we do a women's learning. We were learning Sefer Shmuel Bet. And in Sefer Shmuel Bet, it's fascinating. It's all the stories of David HaMelech, right? And that was the golden age. If you ask anyone in the history of Am Yisrael, what was maybe Shlomo HaMelech, right? But David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, that was the golden age. But you read the stories and they're actually quite shocking, right? Even, okay, it's not Sefer Shoftim. I grant you that. It's not as bad, right? Definitely not. But they're quite shocking. There's some really nasty things that are going on. There's lots of factions, there's lots of rebellions. It sounds much like Israeli politics today, maybe even worse, right? And I was standing outside Shul afterwards discussing with a few women, and I suddenly turned around to them and I said to them, do you know what? We are living the golden age. We are in the golden age of Jewish history. In 500, 600, 700 years' time, when people write Jewish history books, they will talk about the periods we're in today as the golden age of the people of Israel. We have never had it so good. We never had it so good, right? But it all depends. And at the same time, we had other women complaining that one friend went to Australia recently, her and her family, she's Israeli, and they were traveling there for 3 months. And all she wants to do, all she kept saying is, everything is terrible here. We should all move to Australia, right? She's probably right. But the point is, and I kept saying to her again and again, I was like, you're 100% right, Shirley. I said, but if you want to have Jewish grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-great-grandchildren, moving to Australia is not going to do that. right? Meaning but don't forget, you want to be a Jew, this is the place to be a Jew. You want to be part of Jewish destiny, this is where it plays out. You want to look back on our history, we're living in the best period we've had in thousands of years. How can you not be a part of that? Everything is about perspective. Everything is about perspective. And I think so much more so, when we look at Sefer Bamidbar, we realize it. If we want a manifesto of how we're going to enter Eretz Yisrael today, in 2023, how are we going to enter Eretz Yisrael? Look to Sefer Bamidbar. Okay, so that's the first thing I would say, perspective. The prism wasn't the place, but the perspective. The second thing, right? Here's some echoing. Can we mute everyone on Zoom? I'm really sorry. Can we mute? Can we mute? Can we mute? Thank you. Okay. A pawn. Why is this so important? Another massive theme we see in Sefer Bamidbar. We also see in Sefer Shemot, but even more so in Bamidbar. Sefer Bamidbar is the interim space. It's an interim space between being slaves and being free people. How do you move a nation from slavery to freedom? How do you do that? They are pawns. They see themselves as pawns. They see themselves as passive, as affected by, as not as agents of their own destiny. So how do you take them and show them that human beings, pawns, so to speak, can actually be the highest power? How do you give back a people their agency? Now, what we're going to see is the answer is ultimately that Moshe and HaKadosh Baruch Hu could not do that. They realized that the first generation that came out of Egypt were not a generation that could go and fight battles. And we'll unpack where we see it and how we see it, but they had to die out. But even still, there are many messages in Sefer Bamidbar of how they become, how important the message, the lessons of how we become free. And again, I say it like this: we're not slaves today, thank God. We live in a democratic society, but all of us are enslaved in some way or another. All of us as parts within ourselves have parts and elements of self that are enslaved. And the biggest question is, again, when we read Sefer Bamidbar, we could say, oh, that's talking about a nation of slaves. We're not that, we never were that. We can argue maybe the Holocaust generation was a nation of slaves and coming to Israel, but we're already past that. But I really think that the messages here are so deep and so human that they apply to each and every one of us individually, as well as us as a nation. So I'm going to, and the idea of the Midnight Library is also this idea of choices, right? What are the choices that I make? Again, the whole Sefer Bereshit, those of you that were journeying with me in Sefer Bereshit for the first 4 years, we saw how important human choice is, how difficult human choice is, how sometimes the protagonists got it wrong, and sometimes they got it right, and sometimes they didn't even know. Okay, the story of Yaakov, for example, what he did, the text is very ambiguous whether he was right or wrong. Until the end of his life, we do not know if Hashem seems to agree with what he did or didn't agree with what he did. Okay, many choices that we make, we may not know if they are the right choices, but we have to use all the resources that we have as human beings to make that choice. The same in Sefer Bamidbar. In Sefer Bamidbar, if Sefer Bereshit was looking at it from an individual perspective, Sefer Bamidbar looks at that idea of choice from a national perspective, though there are still individual stories within. So now I want to jump in. Leadership in what is the wilderness? What does it mean? And I want to begin with Erica Brown. Erica Brown has a beautiful book called Leadership in the Wilderness about Sefer Bamidbar. We're going to be touching on it a few times. And she begins already by talking about this idea of the interim space. What is the Midbar? The Midbar is this place in between. And for us, we already know it's in a very, very literal way. It's an in-between space between Mitzrayim and geographically in Eretz Israel. So on a geographical level, it's the interim space. On the psychological level, it's the interim space between slavery and freedom, right? And on the conceptual level, it's the interim space whereby the people themselves are able to form a relationship with God. Okay, so there's 3 different levels of interim space that happen in Sefer Bamidbar. I'm going to share with you what Erica Brown says. She says as follows: there is a place between 2 familiar spaces that defies identity. In art, we call it negative space. It is the outline of the borders of tangible reality that is itself an unnamed reality. It is the space between 2 chairs that help define the relationship of the chairs to each other. It may be the space between 2 buildings or a tree and a person. That empty space may be represented by a simple set of lines and curves that is often drawn first, only then followed by the demarcation of the actual shapes. It is this drawing of negative space that offers the rest of the represented images an identity. The space that isn't defines the space that is. Okay, is everyone getting that? The space that isn't defines the space that is. In politics and literature, it may be the experience of exile, right? When we are in exile, we're set out from the space that we want to be in, okay? An exile defines himself or herself by where he or she is not by the place of current residence. At the same time, this self-definition does not tell the whole story of personal existence. You can be from a place, but not of it. Dislocation can be in and of itself defining, even if it is unintentionally so. Those of you that learned with me last year, we spoke about the idea of liminal space. Those of you that remember liminal space, we spoke about it in terms of where Yosef leaves his brothers and he meets the Ish B'Sadeh. Before he gets to his brothers, right, he goes looking for his brothers, he meets the Ish B'Sadeh. And the Sadeh there represents this idea of liminal space. It's a space, liminal space, it can be in many different, it can manifest itself in many different ways. Liminal space can be a literal place, like a geographical location between borders, or it can be a place where you're moving from it's like a transformation period, whereby you're moving from one thing to another. For example, the bar and bar mitzvah year or ceremony or whatever you want to call it is often seen as liminal space. A Brit Milah in Eliyahu Hanavi comes at the time of liminal space. It's the, not the transformation, what's called the, when you move from one thing to another, the transition. The transition, it's like a transitional place before when you're moving from one stage to another. So what Erica Brown here is talking about in terms of the Midbar, I think is very similar. She calls it negative space. I would probably call it liminal space, but it's that space that you can't quite define, right? But by not defining it, you're already negatively showing that it's not exactly where you're meant to be permanently. It's a temporary place. It's a place that you have to go through in order to get to the next place. That is the Midbar. And now I want to read you source number 2. Yehi b'shalach Torah ta'am v'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz Plishtim ki karov hu ki amar Elokim. Why did Hashem send them straight to Eretz Yisrael? Why does He send them through Midbar? They could have gone through the Eretz Plishtim. Ki amar Elokim pen yinachem ha'am b'ro'atam milchama v'shuvu Mitzrayima. He was worried. What was he worried about? That they would have to fight and they would want to go back to Mitzrayim. The irony of that sentence, right? Because what happens in the end? They anyway want to go back to Mitzrayim, even though they go through the Midbar, right? Even though they don't have to fight. In the end, they have to fight Amalek, but that's another story, right? So what does this mean? Look at the Mechilta. The Mechilta is an old, a very old Midrashic source. Variantly, for it was near. The Holy One, blessed be He, did not bring them directly to Eretz Yisrael by way of the desert, saying, if I bring them there now, immediately each person will seize their field, each person their vineyard, and they will neglect Torah study. Rather, I will keep them in the desert for 40 years, eating manna and drinking from the well, and the Torah will be absorbed in their bodies. What does this mean? The Midrash here seems to suggest that the reason they do not go the short way is because they have to learn Torah. What does that mean, learn Torah? What's the Midrash saying here? If we go straight to the land, says the Midrash, the people will become so obsessed with their houses, with the parnasa, with survival, right? Later on, we're going to bring Abraham Maslow's chart, right? Which shows the different levels of survival, at what human fruition, when does that happen, right? How do we become enlightened individual? Only first and foremost, according to him, when you have your basic necessities, right? You can't become enlightened and seek wisdom if you're worrying about what food you're going to put on the table. And the Midrash here seems to suggest that if we go straight to Eretz Yisrael, we're not going to be able to learn Torah, right? We're not, because we're going to be so worried about the land, okay? So what does that mean? It means we have to go through this interim period. We have to go through this period of in-between. I want to share with you an essay, and I highly recommend, those of you that are in my classes will remember this because I've used it quite a few times. Yuval Levine, who's a very well-known social commentator, and he's not a philosopher, he's definitely a thinker in America, contemporary thinker in America. He wrote an essay called Taking the Long Way. I just realized that I copy-pasted the link, but it didn't do the www. You can look it up on YouTube. I recommend reading the whole thing. It's not very long. It's a really fascinating article. And there he speaks about exactly his commentary. His article is a commentary on this verse in Exodus, this verse in Sefer Shemot, where Hashem says, I'm not going to take them through the short way. I'm going to take them through the long way. And his entire commentary talks about the idea of the long way to liberty. What does it mean to be a free people? What does it mean to have liberty in the true sense of the word, in the authentic sense of the word? And his answer is that today we think that we can take the short way to liberty. Society today thinks culturally, and the generation today thinks that freedom means what I can take, what I can get, what my rights are. And he says that's the short way to liberty. The long way to liberty, and this is what he says here, is much harder, and it's much more difficult, and it requires an interim period. Listen to what he says. The liberty we can truly recognize as liberty is achieved by the emancipation of the individual, not just from coercion by others, but also from the tyranny of his unrestrained desire. You want to know what true freedom is? True freedom, says Yuval Levine, is not my ability to say, I want this now, right? It's not, as my kids always say, if I was really free, I'd be able to go to the beach every day and not have to go to school. Right, true. But then what would happen in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? Would you be free then? No, because what would happen? You listen to your immediate desire when you were younger, but when you're older, you've got no choices. Okay, what does it mean to be truly free? It actually means sometimes to put in boundaries, to create your own self-boundaries, self-restraint, to see the long term, not just the short term. This is hardly a novel insight, of course. Socrates helped Thrasymachus, I don't know how to pronounce, to see in the 5th century BC. Well before that, at Mount Sinai, it was revealed to a nation of slaves freed from Pharaoh's dominion. But is a truth our high self-esteem sometimes makes us forget. Okay, I've skipped a lot of it. This leads to an increasingly dangerous failure of self-knowledge. A liberal society depends on the long way of moral formation, yet it does not understand itself as engaged in such formation. He criticizes the way in which society is formed today. He argues to bring back certain constructs that have got lost, like the family, education, things that allow for the formation of a proper moral basis in society, and for what he calls the long term to liberty. But if the long way to liberty is truly to lead us to a freedom that is more than license, it's such an important sentence, right? A freedom that is more than license. People think today to be free is to be able to do whatever I want. No, it must draw as well upon an ideal of human emancipation that is more than political. Rabbi Sachs speaks about this in many of his books, but if you want one book where he really unpacks it, it's called The Home We Build Together. And there he speaks a lot about this idea of how do we build a society that is moral as well as political. And he says a state, okay, a contract is amoral, right? To have a contract in a state and for the state to give me everything I need, that's an amoral state. But if you want to create a society that is, its basis, its foundation is moral, it has to be done through what he calls the social covenant. But the problem is that the social covenant is something that cannot be coerced. A state can coerce me to pay taxes, to abide by their laws, etc., etc. But what is really, truly authentic to morality, okay, religion, family, social ties, philanthropy, volunteering, all of these things, right? They cannot be coerced. They have to be chosen. And the problem today is because we have tapped in only to our short-term desires, we have lost even family, even what you have to invest to be part of a family. When we only look to ourselves, we have basically ruptured the fabric of a moral society. And this is exactly what Levine's saying. I'm going to connect back to Bamidbar in a minute. The ultimate soul-forming institutions of the liberal age, as of every age, are religious institutions. And the ultimate preparation for liberty is the practice of faithful obedience. Religion, in this sense, offers a direct challenge to the ethic of the liberal society, an explicit correction of its excesses. Religious institutions are not just counterbalances, but foundations of the liberal order. They command us to a mixture of responsibility, sympathy, lawfulness, righteousness that align our wants with our duties. Okay, I would say even more, our rights with our responsibilities, right? They help form us to be free. And what is true of religion in particular is true more generally of the institutions of the long way to liberty. They are foundational to liberalism, not so much because they counteract its vices, it's because they prepare human beings to handle the burdens and responsibilities of being free. I'm going to stop here for a second. The people of Israel come out of Sefer, people of Israel come out of Mitzrayim, of Egypt. Slaves do not have responsibilities. In fact, slaves don't even have a history or a family. Slaves are lone individuals who only care and are concerned about survival themselves. They're concerned about self-survival because that's what they have to be concerned about. How, oh how, do you move such an individual, and when it's a group of individuals as a nation, to a nation that sees something besides the self and survival? How does one do that? Sefer Bamidbar is the answer to that. Sefer Bamidbar is the book, the interim book that shows us how an individual and a people move from the I to the we. Again, I bring up Rabbi Sachs. His last book before he died was Morality. And the book was all about the movement from the I to the we. That is what freedom is about. Freedom is not what today's society tells us to be free is, only thinking about myself. No, true liberty is when I'm able, dafka, to see beyond myself. I'm able to understand that sometimes I have to put up boundaries. I have to create stoppers, right, of my own desires in order to achieve something transcendent, something beyond the I, something that is bigger than just my own self-interest. I'm going to continue. When the book of Exodus tells us that God did not take his liberated people to the promised land through the land of the Philistines, but opted instead for a longer way through the desert, it also tells us why. God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Untutored and unformed, confronted too quickly with the costs and the burdens of liberty, they might choose slavery. Okay, it's really unbelievable. I said to you, I talked to you about this last time. when we went just now in the summer, we did the West Coast and we went to Alcatraz. And one of the things I found amazing about Alcatraz was the library. And in the library, they had, it was super interesting because in the beginning, when they sent in San Francisco, I'm talking about the prison in San Francisco, for those who don't know what Alcatraz is, they used to send the prisoners, they weren't interested. They wanted to get the prisoners out of society. That was the aim of Alcatraz at the beginning. And over time, they realized as people became more enlightened, that they actually had to not just send them away, but they had to rehabilitate them, right? And allow them to come back into society. And one of the ways in which they did that was through this idea of giving the prisoners books and allowing them to read. And there's some incredible quotes there. And one of them was that one of the prisoners wrote that the men who spent their time reading books and becoming enlightened rehabilitated in society by a far higher percentage than those that didn't. Those that didn't got sent back very, very quickly to Alcatraz. And I kept thinking to myself as I was reading that, I mean, it's a known fact as well, right? But I kept thinking to myself, what does that say? What does that say? And to me, it says so much about what is needed to move someone from a state of slavery, so to speak, right? Where you're only concerned about the self to a state of freedom, but even more than freedom, liberty, right? Where I recognize that there are goods that are far more valuable, right? That there are purposes, aims, vision that is much greater than just what I want in the here and the now, than just my survival. And by reading, right, and by enlightening themselves, these prisoners understood that in life there were treasures that were so much greater than the immediate self-gratification that they were seeking. Okay, I'm going to continue. For us too, bearing the duties and responsibilities of freedom without being prepared for them poses great dangers, especially the danger of abandoning our liberty in return for security or the passing pleasures and distractions of our abundant age. This danger is avoidable only if we take the long way to liberty, the way that prepares us through the practice of responsibility and through the formation and refinement of our souls. Okay, so it's again a beautiful introduction to why Sefer Bamidbar, the book that was never meant to be, is in fact, I would say, probably one of the most important books for our age today. Of the whole of the Torah, right? It's one of the most important books for our age today because we are living in an age where we are the freest we've ever been, but we are the most enslaved we have ever been. Not in a literal way, right? But in a conceptual way. And the question is how we manage that. And Sefer Bamidbar, in my mind, tells us how. Look at the next source. Any questions till now? Questions, comments? Okay. Source 5. And God spoke to Moses in the wilderness. Why the Sinai wilderness? From here, the sages talk. By the way, for those of you that want these sources, I put them in English just because it's quicker and easier. But for those of you that want, if you go onto Sefaria, type in search Tanya White, you'll find all my source sheets and you'll be able to find this source sheet and there it has the Hebrew and the English of everything, okay? And God spoke to Moses in the Sinai wilderness. Why the Sinai wilderness? From here, the sages taught that the Torah was given through 3 things: fire, water, and wilderness, okay? Look how interesting. 3 things the Torah was given. How do we know it was given through fire? And Mount Sinai was in smoke and God had come down upon it in fire. How do we know it was given through water? And in Judges it says the heavens dripped and the clouds dripped water at Sinai. How do we know it was given through the Midbar, through the wilderness? And God spoke to Moshe in the Sinai wilderness. And why was the Torah given through these 3 things? Just as fire, water, and wilderness are free to all the inhabitants of the world, so too the words of Torah are free to them. As it says, all who are thirsty come for water, even if you have no money. Another explanation. And God spoke to Moshe in the wilderness. Anyone who does not make themselves ownerless like the wilderness cannot acquire the wisdom of the Torah. Therefore, it says in the Sinai wilderness. Okay, this is a very, very important midrash, and it's an important midrash because it begins to tie in what we're doing in this introduction, and that is the idea of how learning Torah and the Midbar are tied to each other. And I think in a sense, if we look at what the Midrash is saying here, it's saying to us two important things. It's saying to us, number one, no one has a monopolization on the Torah. Okay, the Torah is open to everyone. If we think about the story of, remember, Hillel has to go, they don't let him into the Bet Midrash, and he has to go on the top of the Bet Midrash and look inside. Is it Hillel or
No,
Rabbi Akiva, sorry. Rabbi Akiva has to go in and look inside the Bet Midrash, right? So the truth is both Rabbi Akiva and Hillel both represent anyway this idea. Hillel and Rabbi Akiva, in fact, the shiurim I gave in Elul, we looked at those two, we looked at Hillel and Shammai, we looked at Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael. Both of those, I'm sure it is Hillel. I also thought it was Hillel. I didn't think it was Rabbi Akiva. Lo mishaneh. Whoever it was, they had to go to the roof in the freezing cold, and they basically freeze themselves in order to put their ears down to hear the Torah, because they won't let him into the Beit HaMidrash. The idea of the monopolization on Torah happens, by the way, when does it happen? It happens in the world we live in today when there's polarization. Because this group thinks, only I have the true interpretation of the Torah. And this group thinks, only I have the true interpretation of the Torah. How dare he even be so arrogant as to think that he can say something about this Torah? And I'm telling you a story about Rav Benny Lau, which I heard him say here, in, those of you that have heard from me before, I heard him say it here in this room. He said that before he started 929, by the way, is Tanakh Yomi. It's fantastic, it's amazing. Those of you that have never encountered it, from this year, go onto the internet, type in 99. It's Sefer Yehoshua started today, so it's a perfect time to join, okay? And you can do it in any way you want. There's short articles written by a whole host of different people, all different people from all different sectors of Israeli society. I like the Israel site. There's also an English site, but the Hebrew site's, in my mind, much better. And it also has, I listen, because I drive a lot, so I listen. They read you the perek, you have a tafsir, you have like a shortened version, and then you have Rav Benny Lau and a few other people speak. It's beautiful. Why did he start it? He said, this is what happened. He walked into a secular school, which is what he does. He went to go and speak to children, Kita Yud Bet, 12th graders in a secular school. And he took with him, as he does everywhere, he took his Tanakh with him. And he walks into a big room with 12 graders, and he picks up his Tanakh, and he says, I found this in the corridor, who does it belong to? He was trying to make a joke, right? And he said the whole room burst out laughing. And this one girl, not because chutzpah, just because she was like looking at him like, what are you talking about? And she turned around, she said, Harav, ze lo shayach lanu, right? Rabbi, this doesn't belong to us, right? It wouldn't belong to anyone here, right? And all of a sudden he said, he realized that they did not believe that the Tanakh was possessed and held by the Rabbanut or by the religious people. It had nothing, it didn't have anything to say to them. And at that moment, he said, that was the moment I decided we had to do something about this. And he has revolutionized, I have to say, in Israel, revolutionized the way Tanakh is learned in secular schools, for secular people, secular society. It's unbelievable. And that is a danger. And what the Midrash here is telling us is, why is it given in the Midbar? Because it belongs to all of us. There is not one Jew it belongs to more, and not one Jew it belongs to less. So that's the first idea. The second idea that the Midrash seems to talk about, hold on, I just want to go back a second. I've lost the Midrash. Here. Anyone who doesn't make themselves ownerless. What does that mean? What does it mean? The Hebrew word there is hefker. What does it mean to make myself hefker? To make myself, something that's hefker means that it's, nobody possesses it, nobody owns it, it doesn't belong to anybody, right? So what does it mean to make myself hefker? And I think that in a sense, it means to be totally and utterly humble, that to be vulnerable, right? I have nothing, I am making myself open to the Torah. And humility, I would say humility and vulnerability are two of the most important positions that one has to take before one approaches the text. We have a very unique tradition. I'm not sure if there's other religions that have this tradition. I haven't looked into all the religions that exist in the world. Those of you that know, you can come and tell me. But we have a very, very unique tradition that has a written law and an oral law. I would even say not a law, a written tradition and an oral tradition, okay? The written tradition grounds us. It's something that's got permanency. It's something that allows us to know that we have something to fall back on. There's a rock, there's something there, right? The oral law, however, the oral tradition allows us to be open. It allows us to be vulnerable. It allows us to be interpretive and creative, right? And it's a very unique place because in a sense, we're constantly going between the two. When we approach the text, because we have an oral tradition, the text is vulnerable. What do I mean by that? The text, when I open it up, I can do one of two things. I can read the text and I can say to myself, I am only going to read the text according to how I believe the text, the author of the text wants me to read it. And I'm going to stay very, very, very close to all of the people way above me from the past that have read the text in a very certain way. The problem is that all of the people from the past that have read the text all say different things. And that's the beauty of the oral Torah. Therefore, that the minute we open up the text becomes vulnerable to interpretation. And therefore, when I approach the text, I have to also approach it with vulnerability. That is, I have to allow the text to read to me, not close myself off and only approach the text through the prism of one direction. Okay, there has to be, and that is what is to be hefker, to allow myself to be open to the text itself. Why like a midbar? A midbar, a wilderness, is a place of vulnerability. When I am in the wilderness, I am totally and utterly vulnerable, right? I am vulnerable to the climate. I'm vulnerable to animals. I'm vulnerable. And that vulnerability is the source, is the key. I would say it's the key to humanity. It's definitely the key to connection, right? Brene Brown speaks a lot about the idea of vulnerability, that really true relationship can't happen if both people are not in a place, allow themselves to be in a place of vulnerability, right? True connection happens when one is vulnerable. And I would say also that text analysis, when we look at the Torah, we have to place ourselves in that moment of hefker. And from that build up. Look at Rambam in source number 6. He also speaks about the idea of permanency. Okay, and he says the whole book deals with those commandments which were meant only for a particular time, being the periods when the Israelites stayed in the desert. And he deals with the miracles which were done for them in order to tell all the wondrous deeds of the eternal which he wrought for them. It tells us how he began to destroy their enemies before them by the sword, and he commanded that how the land should be divided amongst them. There are no commandments in this book which are binding for all times, except for some commandments about the offerings, which he had begun in the book of the law of the priests in Vayikra, and whose explanation was not completed there. Therefore, he finished them in this book. So on the one hand, the Ramban is saying, he's saying something very profound, very philosophical. He's saying to us, there's nothing permanent in the Sefer Bamidbar, but there are a few permanent things. But I want you to think that there's nothing permanent in this book. Why? Because that is the liminal space. That is the interim space. That is the space of non-permanency. That is the Torah Shabbat Peh. That's the vulnerability of the text. That's the vulnerability of the human being. That's the movement from slavery to freedom. The ability to know that nothing is fixed. And I finished today's class going back to what we read, the Midnight Library, Lahavdil, yeah? But the Midnight Library, again, when he speaks about this idea of the choices that each of us make in our lives, and he puts before this God, the whole point of the book is that this woman, this young woman, believed that she had no choices left in life. She believed that her life was going to pan out terribly, and she had no choice but to commit suicide. And the entire book, right, the polemic, I would say, of the book, right, or the message of the book, the argument of the book, is that at any point, right, we have a choice to take a different book out from the library. We have a choice to make our lives different. And in a sense, to me, that is what the Ramban is saying here. The Ramban is turning around and saying, Sefer Bamidbar introduces us to the idea of liberty through the Midbar. through the interim space, through the place of vulnerability, but it will only work if we don't fix ourselves. If we understand that to get to the point of Eretz Yisrael, the point of freedom, the point of being a nation in our land, we have to begin in the wilderness. We have to begin as hefker. We have to begin as being vulnerable, right? That is how we get to build ourselves up as individuals and as a nation. So with that, I finish this class. Next class will continue. Are there any questions? What was that? Oh, no class next week. 2 weeks time. Okay. It's election day next week. Any questions? I apologize. I have to run very fast after this class. I'm always happy to stay 5 minutes and chat, but otherwise I have to run. You have my website at the top, my new website at the top of the sheets. You can always contact me through email with pleasure. I also have a WhatsApp group where I share ideas if anyone wants to join. Then also you on the website, you can join the group. See you all next time.
Thank you so much.